be doing that in the final hour. Okay, so first let's return to Confucius. Yesterday I was talking about how I was basically butchering the analects of Confucius, right? Now, to serve as a segue into what I'm going to talk about today, I'd like to give an example from my earlier work in interpreting to give people an idea of how I got interested in all of this. I've been told that a lot of you here also do a lot of interpreting, and that was something that I also did a lot of since I was very young. And when I first started doing interpreting, a lot of people in the audience would correct me when I'm wrong, and that is a very good thing. I learned a lot from them. But I also noticed that there are times when people tell me things that are correct, and I would adopt them right away. There are times when they're not wrong, they're not correct, and sometimes I would ignore the suggestion. But the most interesting things are the ones that are in between. They're not exactly right, and they're not exactly wrong either. And it's these instances that really got me thinking. I'll give you an example. I remember there was a time when I was translating for a speaker who was talking about Tibetan Buddhism. And he started out by giving an introduction to Tibetan Tantric Buddhism and talking about the different sects. The speaker was speaking in Chinese, so he was saying, 西藏密宗可以分为红教、黑教、黄教、白教. And my interpretation was that Tibetan Tantric Buddhism could be divided into the black sect, the white sect, the yellow sect, and the red sect. During the break, somebody in the audience came and approached me and said, no, that's wrong. That's not what they're called. These sects are called the Nyingma sect, and the Kagyu sect, and the Sakya sect, and the Gelugpa sect. These would be the proper names, and sometimes people of these sects didn't even like to be referred to by the color of their pants. And that got me thinking. Of course, the speaker was completely right, but there was also something that made me a little reluctant to do it this way. The way I was looking at it, the speaker was introducing Tantric Buddhism to an audience that did not know that much about this discipline. If I had used these transliterated terms, the audience would not have been familiar with them. They would have gone blank. Whereas the Chinese audience was getting something very different. They were getting 4 different colors that would stick in their heads. So should I go with the colors that are not completely accurate? Or should I go with the technical terms that would be accurate, but that the audience would not remember? And, well, I wasn't quite sure what to do at the time. It wasn't until I started reading the translation theory of the 1990s that I began to realize that this is what the theorists were really interested in. This is one of the main things about translation. Now, back in the 1960s, people were interested in converting the meaning that's embedded within a text. So translation was all about encoding and decoding the message that's within a text and converting it accurately into another language. Whereas starting in the 1990s, people started to look at translation differently. To use the example I just gave you, the translator, in a way, is like a master manipulator. He's like a magician. When I was in that position, I could make the audience see colors in their heads: red, white, yellow, or what's the other color? Red, white, yellow, black. Or I could make them see no colors at all. The power was within me to choose. I could also favor one segment of the audience, the more educated, let's say, the people who knew about Tantric Buddhism already, and make them understand better at the expense of the other listeners. Or I could tailor my translation towards those without a background. Again, that's within my power. So people started to see translation within the framework of power relations. And that's something I'll be talking about in the second hour today. Okay, returning to the analects, to give a quick recap. Yesterday we talked about Scopus theory, about how translation can be determined by the purpose that you want to do with your translation. And then I started talking about what I was doing with the analects, the text of the analects, starting with the names of the disciples, and also the genre that I wanted to translate into. I have some remaining examples about names, and then I'm going to move quickly into culture. Let me skip some of these. Oh, okay, let's look at this one. In this example, Confucius talks about the different musicians. He is actually really into music. He collects music from different states, and he is sad that the best musicians from his native state of Lu Senior musician, master Zhi went to Qi. Conductor for the second course, Gan went to Shu. Conductor for the third course, Liao went to Cai. Conductor for the fourth course, Xue went to Qin. Okay, to somebody who lived in his time, these are famous people, you would know who they are, and you would be sad that they're leaving. To somebody from our time, we have no idea who these people are and where they're going. So it's just a huge list of names of people going someplace. And what I did was, you can actually see a parallel situation with Russian musicians who left Russia and came to the West. So names like Igor Stravinsky, Sergei Rachmaninoff, Rudolf Nureyev, okay, maybe not a musician, but an artist, Mikhail Baryshnikov. And by using these examples, I think it would stick in people's heads a little better. Okay, this is another example of converting celebrities from a contemporary period. Okay, let's look at this one. Zilu inquired about consummate persons. The master replied, persons who are as wise as Zhang Wuzhong, as free from desire as Meng Gongchuo, as bold as Bian Zhuangzi, and as cultivated as Zhen You, and who in addition have become refined through observing ritual propriety and playing music. Such people can be said to be consummate. Of course, you have to know who these people are in order to appreciate it. And most of us have no idea who Zhang Wuzhong or Meng Gongchuo are. So we would need to find contemporary exemplars from our age, and I tried my best to do that. So you would have to have the brains of Einstein and the brawn of Rambo, plus the humility of Gandhi and the charm of James Bond, not to mention a Hampton's upbringing and an Ivy League degree. And that, I think, gives you a good idea of what he was trying to say. Okay, mythical emperors. Confucius loved to quote or loved to give as examples the emperors Yao and Shun. To him, that was a golden period in Chinese history. So in this example, where Zigong asks, if there were one able to broadly extend his benevolence to the common people and bring succor to the multitudes, what would you make of him? Could such a person be called good? Confucius thinks this is too good. He thinks it's so good, in fact, that even somebody like Yao or Shun would find such a task daunting. And of course, you would have to know who Yao or Shun were in order to appreciate it. So I simply converted this to, for even the Dalai Lama and the Holy Father fall short on this measure. Okay, that's probably enough for people. Let me move into, do we want to look at this one? Okay, this is an example where Confucius talks about the legendary warriors, Yi and Ao. Yi was a good archer, and then Ao was somebody who was so strong, a strong man, who could push a boat over dry land, and yet they met violent deaths, whereas other ordinary people, such as Yu and Shi, took part in planting crops, and basically were able to retain the empire. So I switched out Yi and Ao to Napoleon and Hitler, who conquered the world and struck fear in the eyes of their foes, and yet they died terrible deaths, whereas Clinton and Gore simply fixed the economy and now are remembered as architects of lasting peace. Okay, let's go and look at, there are some instances where you cannot find suitable replacements, or where the list is so long that it's simply easier to just omit them and not mention any names at all. This is something that's commonly used in interpreting. And there's one instance where I do this in the Elements. This is where, when speaking of Dukeling of Wei, the master said that he lacked the way, and Qi Kangzi, who was a member of one of the three powerful families, said, well, if so, why doesn't he beat with failure? And Confucius says, well, he has Zhong Shu Yu to receive foreign envoys, Invocator Tuo to supervise ancestral temples, and Wang Sun Jia to handle military affairs. In other words, he had good people working for him in the different areas, and that's why his country was still in a good state. So I used Russia as an example again. Why hasn't Russia been run to the ground? If Ivan the Terrible was so terrible? Well, with the rich tapestry of Russian traditions, the long arm of Russian diplomacy, and the formidable size of the Russian army, Russia has never been run to the ground. In this case, I omitted all of the names. Okay, let's talk about cultural refractions. Confucius lived in a time where the culture was very different from the modern culture that we live in now. There were elaborate ceremonies that were considered proper. If you didn't go through with these rituals, then you were considered not to be doing the right thing. And this here, the declaration of the new moon ceremony, is one of them. So Confucius's disciple Zigong was asking. He wanted to dispense with the sacrifice of a live sheep at the declaration of the new moon ceremony. And the master said, Zigong, you grudge the sheep, I ritual propriety. Now, the problem I have with this is that most modern readers are not familiar with the declaration of the new moon ceremony. In fact, it is so strange that it's probably going to hijack the entire passage. They're probably going to wonder, what is the ceremony? What is it about the sacrifice of this live lamb? And that is actually in the backdrop, whereas ritual propriety should be the thing that's in the foreground, and that is going to be missed. So what I wanted to do here is I wanted to take this unfamiliar ceremony, the declaration of the new moon ceremony, and graft it onto a familiar American tradition, an American holiday that everybody can identify with, that also involves the sacrifice of some sort of animal, and I chose Thanksgiving. So you have Sly at Woodstock saying, what do you say we put an end to the slaughter of turkeys on Thanksgiving Day? And Confucius says, you're sad to see the birds die. I get that. But the alternative is to kill off a venerated American tradition. Now that I cannot live with. And that, I think, gives you a better idea of the dilemma that they're debating here. One wants to preserve the tradition. The other wants to preserve life. And both are seen as good things. So you have to prefer one over the other.
Vegetarian turkey.
Vegetarian turkey, very good. But they probably didn't have that back then. Okay, now here's another one regarding cultural traditions of the time, things that were considered good in Confucius's day. Yang Hui asked how to govern the state. The master said, observe the calendar of the Xia, ride in the chariot of Yin, wear the cap of Zhou. As for music, follow the coronation hymn of Shun and the victory hymn of Wu. Prescribe the music of Zheng. Okay, probably nobody now knows what the calendar of the Xia is. You've probably never seen the chariot of the Yin, but you can sort of deduce from this passage that the calendar of the Xia is supposed to be the best of their choices, right? The chariot of the Yin is probably the best of the chariots, and the cap of the Zhou was probably the best of the caps. So he's basically saying, use the best of everything. And also for music, some types of music are considered proper, others are not. Okay, so just translate that into what our preferences would be in our age. Confucius says, Arius was playing peace, wear an Italian suit, and drive a German car. Only ever listen to classical music and avoid the sounds of the ghetto. Now, people might not think the sounds of the ghetto is that bad, but to create the contrast between classical music and something, I put it there. Also notice the rhythm and the symmetry. In giving this example, the calendar of the Xia, the chariot of the Yin, and the cap of the Zhou, these are supposed to have the same rhythm. So in choosing a translation, I also have to have something that could fit within such a metrical frame. Swiss timepiece, Italian suit, German car.
Death metal would work there too, the way it sounds.
What?
Death metal.
Oh. Okay, let's get this one. Let's see. Okay, here's another one. The master says exemplary persons are not competitive except when they have to be in the archery ceremony. Greeting and making way for each other, the archers ascend the hall, and returning they drink a salute. Even in contesting, they are exemplary persons. So they're basically saying men shouldn't fight each other except in sports. And their representative sports of the day is archery. And even when they're doing archery, they have ceremonies that, in addition to competition, make you friends, such as drinking. And I think we do the same thing now. So guys don't get physical except in sports. Even then, they slap each other on the back before the game, and then they all go out for a beer when it's over. There's sportsmanship for you. Now, next I want to talk about Confucius's quotes. Now, quotes only make sense when you know what people are quoting. Otherwise, it sounds like you're just making it up. You're just saying stuff rather than quoting something. And the problem with most of Confucius's quotes is that not many people are familiar with them. So in this example, you know what, this one's too long. Let me go to the next one. Let's look at this one. Wang Sunjia, if you remember, Wang Sunjia is the person under the bad emperor we mentioned earlier, who was in charge of military matters. Okay, so this military person, Wang Sunjia, asked, what do you think about the saying, it is better to pay homage to the kitchen stove than to the corner shrine? Anybody heard of the saying before? Okay, so apparently it was popular back then, and the master did not agree with it. This is not so. Once you have incurred the wrath of heaven, there is no one to whom you can pray for help. So we need a saying that means more or less the same thing. Better to pray to this person than to that person, and yet Confucius disagrees because that person that you're praying to isn't so great either. It's going to incur the wrath of heaven. So the saying that I used was, they say, better the devil you know. Is there any truth to that? And better the devil you know isn't to be taken literally. It doesn't mean that you should really go and worship a devil. It just means that between several choices, you go with the one that you're more familiar with, right? But Confucius here interprets it literally and says, if you befriend the devil and incur the wrath of God, then all the prayers in the world will not save you. Yeah.
The original sentence
Mm-hmm.
from philosophy, some parts of Eastern philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
It says engaging in the daily life chores
Mm-hmm.
is more important than, it's not like one game versus another, but that is more important than going to a spiritual pursuit of oneself. I guess you need a spiritual pursuit,
Mm-hmm.
but seems to be what is the same.
So you're saying the kitchen shrine would be a daily pursuit?
The kitchen stuff is doing your job properly, with attention, as opposed to trying, which is like a designated spiritual practice, whereas regular spiritual practice is everything.
That's very interesting. That would give it a totally different angle altogether. I'll definitely think about that. Yeah, thank you. Okay, in addition to quoting popular sayings, another category that Confucius quotes from a lot is the Book of Songs. These are popular songs at the time, and these are songs that, from the way people react in the analects, it seems like everybody's familiar with these lyrics. So you have a lot of lyrics like this. The master says, only Zilu can stand in his tattered gown by the side of people wearing pine furs without feeling any embarrassment. And then he quotes the lyric, without envy and without greed, he must be a good man. From then on, Zilu was continually chanting these two lines. So if you can picture Zilu dressed up in tattered clothes, sitting in the street, and then other people wearing fancy clothes walking past him, and he's not disturbed by it at all. This is the imagery that is being presented here. And then you want a lyric that sort of represents this. So what I went with was the Beatles. I don't care too much for money. Money can't buy me love. So you have Zilu, who doesn't have any money, and yet he doesn't care. And because he's being praised for this, he sings this line to every passing stranger. Another example would be this. Okay, so this passage begins with a quote from a lyric. The flowery branch of the wild cherry, how swiftly it flies back. It is not that I do not love you, but your house is far away. The master does not agree with it. He says, he did not really love her. Had he done so, he would not have worried about the distance. And what I did was, I'm leaving on a jet plane, don't know when I'll be back again. Oh babe, I hate to go. Confucius says, if he really hates to go, he wouldn't be stepping on a jet plane in the first place. Okay, let's get this one. And what makes things sometimes even more complicated is very often Confucius doesn't take the meaning of the lyrics literally, or rather he distorts them. He takes what appears to be the surface meaning and gets it to mean something else. So in this example, Confucius' disciple, Xia, asks about the meaning of this lyric. And this is obviously about a beautiful woman. Her smiling cheeks, so radiant, her dazzling eyes, so sharp and clear. It is the unadorned that enhances color. And he asks Confucius, what does it mean? Confucius doesn't like to talk about beautiful women, so he changes the subject. He says this is about art. It's about the application of color to the unadorned. In other words, when you draw, you need a blank canvas. Now on the blank canvas, that's where you will apply color. So he changes the topic this way. And in this way, he kind of distorts the lyrics of the song. But this conversation is only possible because both of them are familiar with this lyric. And it goes on. There's more to this that I don't have. But what I use is, you have August asking, what's the meaning behind Starry, Starry Nights? Paint your palette blue and gray. Look out on the summer's day with eyes that know the darkness in my soul. And then Confucius answers, it's about an artist who tries to sketch the trees and the daffodils and catch the breeze and the winter chills in colors on the snowy linden land. So you're both quoting from the same lyric, showing that they both know what they're talking about. Okay, so this is the treatment of lyrics. Next, I want to talk a little about meter and cohesion. I'm going to begin with this passage here. You have one of the kings, Qi Jinggong, asking Confucius about politics and leadership. And Confucius's answer is 君君臣臣父父子子. For those of you that don't know Chinese, if you look at those characters in the third line, you can see that the first and second character are the same character, and then 3 and 4 are the same, 5 and 6 are the same, and 7 and 8 are the same. The first character basically means king or ruler, but you have it twice. Why is it there twice? This is because in classical Chinese, it's pretty common for words to be converted from one part of speech to another. So the first dream means king, and then the second dream means to be like a king, to behave like a king. So if you draw an analogy with English, it's kind of like in English, the word pilot can mean a noun, and it can also be a verb, as in the pilot piloted the plane, or friend, the friend unfriended somebody on Facebook, let's say. So this is the pun that Confucius is playing with. He's using king as both noun and verb, and then subject as both noun and verb, and father as both noun and verb, and son as both noun and verb. If you were to translate this passage literally, as Ames and Rosemont have done, then what you end up with is something like this. Duke Jing of Qi asked Confucius about governing effectively. Confucius replied, the ruler must rule. That works, right? The minister, minister. Does that work? Kind of, okay. The father, father. It works, but the meaning has changed. Because for the father to father, it means for the father to give birth to children. And that's not, at least that's what most people don't think. That's what fu means over here. And then the son, son. I don't think son is in English, right? So here you preserve the structure, but you're sacrificing the grammar or the syntax of the target language. Okay, what most translators have chosen to do is something like this. A compromise. There's government when the prince is prince and the minister is minister, when the father is father and the son is son. Does that work? Yeah, that works, right? That works, but then what does it mean for the prince to be prince? That is sort of left to your imagination, right? You sort of have to imagine that the prince has to be a certain way and the minister has to be a certain way. That is not something that's given to you. But another thing that's nice about this is that you can see, although there are 4 groups of characters, they actually come in pairs in that the Jun and the Chen, the king and the minister, these are opposites. And then you have the father and the son, and these are opposite relationships too. And in this translation, the opposites are shown. So you have a comma for prince and minister. Sorry, you have a semicolon between prince and minister and also father and son. It's divided into 2 halves. Now, what I've tried to do is I wanted to give more essence to the verb. I want to, instead of saying, let the prince be a prince, I want to demonstrate the quality that is needed of the prince or the king. I haven't completely succeeded in it, but I'll show you what I have. What I have is expect leaders to lead and followers to follow. Allow parents to parent and kids to kid around. That way I can have the same word used for all of the nouns and all of the verbs. But I wasn't too happy with the register of parents to parent. So yeah, that is something that remains to be fixed. Okay, let's skip to the next one. Okay, let's come back to the very beginning of the analects, the very first passage that a lot of people are familiar with. 学而时习之，不亦乐乎？有朋自远方来，不亦乐乎？人不知而不愠，不亦君子乎? Now, let me first give you a little translation, which usually comes out like this. Studying and from time to time going over what you've learned, that's enjoyable, isn't it? To have a friend come from a long way off, that's a pleasure, isn't it? Others don't understand him, but he doesn't resent it. That's the true gentleman, isn't it? How many of you are familiar with this passage? Okay. Do you see any problem with this? Well, these are three random things, right? Suppose I were to say, dogs are cute, aren't they? Trump is going to get reelected, isn't he? It's not nice to spit in public, don't you think? Okay. If I were to say something like that, the average reaction would be first, the speaker is crazy. What's the relation between these three things? Or the listener would try to build a relation between these statements. Are you saying that Trump is some sort of dog? Did Trump spit in public at some point that I didn't notice? So a link is needed between passages. That is one of the very basic things about human conversation. So I think the question we need to ask here is, what is the link between these three statements? Is there a link? And I believe that there is. Now, first, let's look at it from two different angles, a formal angle and a topical angle. First, the formal angle. Notice the meter. The first line consists of 9 syllables, right? The second line is 10. The third line is 11. So you have a gradual buildup, so to speak, and this may have some significance. In terms of syntax, you have a topic followed by a rhetorical question. And the format of the rhetorical question is you have a negation particle followed by an adverb and an adjective and then a question particle. In terms of the topic, I believe that the formal buildup mirrors a buildup on the topical side. So in stage 1, learning and then having the chance to use your learning. That describes what happens when you're first learning something. This is the joy of discovery. Now, the second sentence, having friends come from afar. People often think that this is friends, but when you look into the character, it's not. What you have here is Peng rather than Pengyo. And Peng, as you can see from the structure of the character, is 2 persons sitting side by side. These are not social friends. These are peers who are learning the same thing. And that kind of ties in with what you have in the first sentence. So the first sentence talks about how it's fun to learn. The second sentence talks about how it's fun to learn with somebody, who's learning the same thing as you. And then you have the third sentence, which talks about once you get this expert knowledge, you're in such a state that you're enjoying something that people outside of the circle don't understand. And that's a really exquisite pleasure. I think once you get there, then you have a buildup of sorts. Okay, how are we doing for tonight? Let me skip this and go to my last example from Confucius before I go on to talk about the new discoveries. Confucius is celebrated as one of the greatest teachers in China. In fact, some authors say he is the greatest teacher in the world. Now, how do we know that? We know that he has said a lot of things. We know that he has a lot of disciples. But has he actually said anything about teaching? Well, in the Analects, we can find one very short passage, one thing that he has said about teaching, and that is this one here from Analects 15.39, consisting of 4 characters, 有教无类. Now, whether or not you know Chinese or not, since it's only 4 characters, I'm going to explain the Chinese anyway. Let's look at the first and the third character. The first yo is to have. The third character, wu, is the opposite of to have, which is not to have. So it's to have something and not to have something. Okay, what do you have? The thing that you have is the second character, jiao, which as a verb means to teach, or you could do it as a noun, meaning something like teaching or education. And then the thing that you don't have is the fourth character there, which means something like type or category. So literally what this means is to have teachings and to not have categories. Can anybody make sense of it? What does it mean? To have teachings and not have categories.
No one's left behind.
No one's left behind? How do you get to no one is left behind from this?
Because there's always a teaching and education.
Mm-hmm.
Always, you don't categorize anyone, no matter what kind of people come to you to teach.
Okay, very good. So,
In a class of his own.
Hmm?
In a class of his own.
in a class,
Of his own. So he is teaching, but there is no category into it.
oh, interesting. Okay, so he has teaching, meaning he does teaching, and his teaching is of a class that nobody can categorize it.
With nobody else, there is no category, existing category in which he is in class of his own.
Okay, there's no category that you could put him into because he's so great. See, it's so terse that it's open to all sorts of interpretations, right?
Category limitation as well. We look at a category as a limitation.
Sure. What do you
have
get?
teachings, but you don't limit yourself in those teachings, or you don't limit you in those teachings.
So you have teachings, you engage in teaching, and yet you don't let teaching become a category that hems you in.
I think I had a similar thought. I was thinking of Aristotle, the great category maker.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking that maybe what Confucius is saying is to something like teaching should break through categories to individual characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that.
Okay, so teaching should be limited to, let's say, existing
Yeah.
categories.
Right.
And you should try to break through and break new ground, basically.
Right.
Yeah, terrific. I think all of these are valid interpretations. So there are literally dozens. I mean, you don't see dozens of interpretations if you just read the popular literature, but if you look at the scholarly literature, you'll see that there are dozens of interpretations of this. Now, what are some of the interpretations that scholars have come up with? Let's go through this quickly. A lot of it has to do with the interpretation of lay, category. What is a category? Okay, some people see it as a subject matter category, in which case you teach, but you don't teach things like math and English and social science. You should just teach everything to everybody. That's one way to look at it. Or a category can refer to students. So students can be divided into categories according to intelligence. You don't distinguish between the smarter students and the dumber students. That's one way to look at it. Or level of learning. You shouldn't distinguish between advanced students and lower level students. Or it could be economic background. You shouldn't differentiate between richer students and poorer students. Or it could be race or ethnicity. Or some people even say it's human nature. You shouldn't distinguish between people of a good nature and of a bad nature. And then there's also the voice that's very important. What is the subject of this to have and to not have? Now, earlier when you were telling me the interpretation that you had, that is the interpretation that you see in textbooks in Taiwan. I think that is probably the most popular interpretation, which is to add a first-person pronoun, an I, into this. So basically, Confucius is talking about himself. So it is basically saying, I teach without categories. Now, the question then you have to ask is, at the level of syntax, is it possible to drop the I, the first person, in a sentence? In English, there are limited situations where you could do this. You can say something like, can't talk now, gotta go. Okay, what you're saying is, I can't talk now, I gotta go. Can you do it in Chinese? Okay, an example. Okay, dropping the I in Chinese and still referring to the first person.
Yes.
Mhm.
主词拿主词去掉，
Mhm.
去掉主词，
Uh-huh.
然后
Can you give me an example?
modern Chinese
Mhm, modern
or
Chinese.
classic Chinese.
Mhm.
short sentence.
Mm-hmm.
Zola.
Zola? When you say Zola, are you saying you're leaving, or are you saying we should be leaving?
Can be two.
Okay. Yeah. In some situations, I think it's possible, but I don't think it's that common in Chinese. So when you say things like 没办法, 输给你了, that's saying 我没办法, or 输给你了. What's more common when you drop the pronoun is to use it as a second person exhortation. So for example, in English, when you say pick up that pen, give it to me, I'm saying you pick up that pen, you give it to me. Okay, in Chinese, you could say 这杯水拿给我, 或者是把书捡起来, and that would be not mentioned in the second person. You could also argue that 有教无类, it has a subject that is in the second person. So it's not Confucius talking about himself, it's Confucius telling you what you should do. When you teach, you should not divide students into category. Sentence.
Like an imperative.
Like an imperative,
Yeah.
definitely. That seems to make more sense. But there's yet another possibility, and this seems to be more often with the Yohan sentences of the time, which is to interpret it as a condition, as an if-then sentence, which makes it if 有教, if you have teaching, then the result is 无类, then there won't be any categories. So let's look at some parallels in English and Chinese. In English, you can say you break it, you pay for it. What you're really saying is if you break it, then you have to pay for it. In Chinese, 有问题来找我. What I'm really saying is 如果有问题, 那就来找我. So what this can come out as is 如果有教, if we provide education, then 那么就不会再有这些不同的类别了. Then we won't have different categories of people. And that's the one that I eventually went with. But you can see all sorts of different interpretations of this in the different translations. If you look at the Lee's translation, my teaching is addressed to all indifferently. So the subject is interpreted as the first person I, and the lay category is interpreted as different types of students. Or Watson says, in matters of education, there should be no class distinctions. So here you see that it's addressed to you, and then the lay is interpreted as different social classes. David Hinton says, in worthy teaching, all things are related. So it seems to be like categories of things. These categories are broken down. Whereas Dawson says, if there is instruction, there is no categorization. So there you have an if-then sentence, but he doesn't make clear what categorization is. So it could be any sort of categorization. What I eventually went with is education removes prejudice. But I may change that still thinking about it. Okay, to end this topic, I want to talk about the new archaeological finds that have come out since 2016. Now, to understand this a little better.
So on the previous,
Yes.
the previous slides, I guess the take-home message is there's no longer need to use sort of simple
Exactly. And not only that, you can think about it this way. I think if we were living before 200 BC, education removes prejudice would have been the more likely interpretation. But an interpretation like my teaching is addressed to all indifferently has been with us since about the 6th century BC all the way to the present day. That's about 1,500 years. That's not a very short period of time either. So you have multiple interpretations that each have a very long tradition. And that is kind of our dilemma.
It's a bit frustrating to not have exact one answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's the way it is.
But on the other hand, this is also something that happens pretty commonly. You can have the same passage interpreted by different people in different times differently, and these different interpretations can be widespread. You could argue that a good text should open itself up to different interpretations and be interpreted in different ways. Okay. Let's talk a little about the transmission of the analects. So the analects started with Confucius, who lived around 500 BC. That's about 2,500 years ago. Now, in chapter 7 of the Analects, he says he 述而不作, which is basically that he speaks, but he doesn't write things down. So he himself did not write a book with all of his sayings. He left that to his disciples. So then we have his disciples' compilations during the Warring States period from about 500 BC to 200 BC. But then the Warring States period ended with the Empire of Qin. During the Warring States, there were different states, each vying for power, each fighting with each other. And then the state of Qin basically won out in the end and defeated all the states. So you have the first emperor of Qin uniting all of China. He united the states, he united the scripts, he united the measurements, and he wanted to unite the thinking. He wanted everybody to think just the way he did. He didn't want any other philosophies. So he burned all the books, and he basically killed a lot of scholars. And a lot of Confucian writings before this were destroyed during this book burning of the Qin. But some did survive. Some survived orally. There were certain schools of oral transmission. The most famous were the Lu school and the Qi school, both in present-day Shandong. Confucius himself was from the state of Lu. So there is a Lu school manuscript version of the Analects, and there is a Qi version. We know from commentaries that the Lu version had 20 chapters, and the Qi version had 22 chapters. So there were slight differences, and the Qi version was also slightly wordier than the Lu version. And in addition to these two versions, in the Han Dynasty, when they tore down the wall in Confucius's old residence, they also found an ancient version that was written not in Han Dynasty script, but in an earlier script. So this is referred to as the ancient or archaic version. So in the Han Dynasty, there were at least 3 major versions that were in circulation. Okay, and then came along this character Zhang Yu. At around 5 BC, he was the tutor to an emperor in the Han Dynasty, and he synthesized the different versions of the Analects based on the Lu version to produce a 20 version of Analects. And his version was so popular that eventually the Lu version and the Qi version and the archaic version were all lost. All that we have left is the Zhang Yu version, the Marquis Zhang version, plus miscellaneous earlier annotations and commentaries on the Analects. So we're left with only the Marquis Zhang version, but we know about these earlier versions from commentaries. But the commentaries give us only fragments, and we don't have the whole thing. So to give you a picture of this, we started out with the Lu version, the Qi version, and the archaic version. Marquis Zhang came along and took all 3 based on the Lu and put together a Marquis Zhang version. This version became so popular that the Lu version vanished, the Qi version vanished, and the ancient version vanished. So we're now left with only a variant of the Marquis Zhang version. That is, until about 2 years ago, when the Qi version sort of resurfaced. In 2016, in a Han Dynasty tomb in Jiangxi, they dug out about 10,000 bamboo slips, and in these slips was what appeared to be a fragment of chapter 22, 知道, of the Qi Analects. Now, what's more interesting is when you look at the text from chapter 22 of the Qi Analects, people then realize that at a different excavation site in the middle of the Gobi Desert, something that they had since 1973, you had the exact same text. So people had it all along. They just didn't know that this was the missing chapter. And what's even more interesting is when they looked at the 1973 site, they had the text not only from chapter 22, but also what appears to be fragments of chapter 21. So when you look at this data and put it together, we are able to bring back fragments of the 2 missing chapters of the Qi Analects, chapter 21, Wen Wang, and chapter 22, 知道. Okay, now you might be asking, what are the 2 missing chapters about? Chapter 21, commentators say it's called Wen Wang, which seems to me asking about the king. And then chapter 22, 知道, in modern Chinese means to know, but back then it means to know about the way or know about the path. Now, if you look at the fragment for chapter 21, Wen Wang, you'll see that it's not about the king at all. It's talking about jade. Okay, so let's look at chapter 22 first. It's a very short fragment, but you have it here. This is the Zhidao fragment from chapter 22. And this is the version from the Gobi Desert, same text. Now let's look at chapter 21, because what's happening here is really interesting too. This is the fragment from chapter 21. It says, 知方也, 思里自外可以知. Okay, so it's hard to understand what it's talking about. But if you search for it, you'll find it under an entry under jade in the Han Dynasty dictionary Shuowen. So you have a quote under the qualities of jade, and this is a fragment of that. And then it suddenly dawned on people that Wen Wang wasn't asking about the king at all. It should have been Wen Yu. The difference between king and jade in Chinese characters is one dot. So somehow that dot got deleted. People thought it was asking about the king, when in fact Confucius was actually asking about jade. And then when you know that it's asking about jade, everything makes sense. Here you have a passage that talks about the qualities of jade. And then if you look to other ancient works from the time, in the Book of Rites, in Xunzi, and in the familial sayings of Confucius, you have entire passages documenting a dialogue between Zigong and Confucius, asking about the qualities of jade. Now, a lot of people have thought that the familial sayings of Confucius were not from Confucius's time at all. They thought that this was a forgery. But more and more, it looks like that a lot of the things that we thought were forgeries are in fact longer passages that are perhaps from the Qi version of the Analects. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that. So we now have the Analects not only in the 20 chapter version, but also some parts from the missing chapters. And that, I think, is what makes working on this work really interesting. Okay, I will end here. Any questions before we move on to the other topic?
Just out of curiosity, what is the future research or translation is happening beyond that?
Okay. I hope they dig out more fragments. I don't think this is all there is to chapters 22 and 21. There's probably more. And I hope as they dig up more ancient grave sites, we'll see more of those. And other than that, I would say that the Analects is something that's been translated a lot of times already. Unless you take a drastically different approach, I don't think there's going to be a lot of new ground in the way you can translate it.
100 years from now, we'll still be able to translate Analects.
Oh, yeah. Yes. I think 100 years from now, you would need a different translation because language changes, society changes, references change. So the examples that we use now will be different from the examples that are familiar to people from 100 years later. So yes, it would have to be retranslated. Sure. Oh, okay. 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 Sure. Yesterday I was talking about the choice of genre in English that you could choose to translate the Analects into. So what's happening is when you translate from one language to another, you also have to decide what genre the text belongs to. And when you have a similar or familiar genre in the target language, it will make it easier for the reader to accept. And taking into account the nature of the Analects, having a lot of monologue and dialogue, the genres that jumped out at me were the philosophical dialogue, the theatrical script, and let's say the chatlogue. And a lot of translation theorists now believe that when you translate, you You have to choose from a limited repertoire of textual grids or genres in the target language in order to make it more acceptable. Let me try to illustrate this using an analogy. It would be nice if I had a real example, but without one, I'm just going to make something up. Let's say you have a society in the jungle of the Amazon, and they like to eat their meals at 3 a.m. in the morning. And at 3 a.m. in the morning, they eat this really exquisite fruit, and it tastes the best at 3 a.m. in the morning. So let's say we're going to import that into the United States. And we're going to open a restaurant that serves that exquisite fruit at 3 a.m. in the morning. Now, that might not work because here people don't have a meal that they eat at 3 a.m. in the morning. In terms of meals, our grid is breakfast, lunch, dinner. And if you want to serve food, the majority of people will be eating at these times. If you don't choose these times, then that's going to make the food that you're going to be presenting a lot less accessible. And the same goes for a text that you're translating from one language into another. You have to ask yourself, what is the category that it's going to fall into in order for the reader to feel familiar with it? I guess that is what I was trying to say. Does that answer your question? Okay. Sure.
Because in our practice, sometimes we switch the subject. For example, or translate Bible to
Yes.
commentary. Sometimes it's like in conversation. Meaning that I'm laying the jungle to general description. How do we find a balance? Meaning that he or you is very active, very confused about the gender or the subject.
I probably need to see the actual text to get a better idea. But are you saying that the subject is vague, or are you saying that the subject shifts? Okay, so sometimes. Okay, I noticed that that's something that happens more often in Chinese. In Chinese, you can have more flexibility like that. English generally does not allow that sort of flexibility. So when you go from Chinese into English, even when it's vague in Chinese, you have to choose one in English. And I imagine that's what you have to do. You might not be sure, but you have to choose between he or she or I, whatever makes the most sense to you. Is that what you were talking about? Okay. An extreme example of that, although this is from a different situation, is in my translation class. An example I give is where, let's see, in Chinese, you make a distinction between older brother and younger brother, right? 哥哥弟弟, or older sister and younger sister, 姐姐妹妹. Whereas in English, you don't. You have brother or sister. When you say brother, you don't know if it's an older brother or a younger brother. So let's say, if I were to say, Mary went to the movies with her brother yesterday, and you want to translate that into Chinese. 玛丽跟她的 what 一起去看电影. You have to choose between 哥哥 or 弟弟, and yet you don't know whether the brother is older or younger. You can't say 兄弟 because it's not usually used in this context, and 兄弟 has other connotations. In some translations, I know they do that, but if you were talking to a friend, you wouldn't just say 我昨天跟我兄弟去看电影, right? You would specify either it's a 哥哥 or a 弟弟.
Or can you use 手足? I 跟我的手足去看电影。
You would say that when you're talking to a friend? Okay. All right. Yeah.
So what do you think about translating to modern Chinese? Because a lot of Chinese students cannot read the classical Netherlands.
Uh-huh.
So what is the problem of translating to modern Chinese?
I've seen a few attempts at that, but it's usually for humorous effect. So yeah, it's been known to be done, and I think it's worth trying. There's a need for it. Okay. Any other questions before we move on? Oh no, there are all kinds of translations into modern Chinese, but I think. Well, maybe I misunderstood you. Did you just mean like translating from classical Chinese into modern Chinese?
Yeah, what
Or
are
did
there
you?
some issues or difficulty of translating classical to modern? Yes, modern Chinese, you cannot read the classical text. We're assuming, people maybe assume that it's Chinese, we can all read it, but most people actually cannot read the classical Chinese.
Okay, let me try to answer that in different levels. There are a lot of modern Chinese translations, Maihua translations of the analects. If you search for it on Google, you can easily find one on the first or second page. But what a lot of these translations do is they translate the language but not the reference. So the language is modern Chinese, but you're still faced with these people, these powerful families, these celebrities that you're not familiar with. So that's one problem with it. And I originally took your question to mean, did anybody translate the culture or the people into modern Chinese culture or modern Chinese people? And that I have only seen in humorous texts. Okay, so I guess we are done with this. Should we move to the second topic or should we break? Let me see. I'd say about between 45 minutes and an hour. Yes. Yes. It would take maybe longer. Yeah. Okay. Let's have a short break.